we're going to be in Matthew 17. I know you all are looking forward to when we read the whole chapter, but I'm going to take a little sideways entrance. We talk about the fatherhood of God, and it's interesting. God does not have a body. He's a spirit, right? We say God is Father, so we picture a man. We picture Santa Claus, old man with big white beard. He must be old. He's God. He's been there forever, right? Like we have all these odd views of God in our head. But God's not a male. He doesn't have a body like us. There's a word, and we're going to read this in light of our passage in Matthew 17, but there's a word in Exodus chapter 34. Moses has this interesting relationship with God. In some ways, he kind of feels like he's minding his own business, and God shows up to him in a burning bush and says, I'm going to use you to lead these people out of slavery. And Moses says, I don't know that I'm the one. I'm sort of an outcast. I'm not fully Hebrew, not fully Egyptian. I stutter. I can't talk well. And God begins to show him, this is who I am. Through these miracles, God leads his people out of slavery in Egypt, and they come to this mountain. And on the mountain, Moses begins this pattern of going up and down, meeting with God, coming down and speaking to the people. And the people, rightly so, God says, don't want to go near the mountain. They see the glory of God and they say, we are too broken to be that close to that kind of glory and holiness. So Moses, why don't you be our mediator and go for us? And this mountain is described, and the presence of God is described in different ways in the book of Exodus. In Exodus chapter 16, verse 10, it talks about the glory of the Lord appeared in a cloud on the mountain. In Exodus chapter 19, verse 16, God descends on Mount Sinai in a thick cloud. Exodus 24, 15 to 18, Mount Sinai is covered by a cloud for 6 days, which is similar to the language we get here in Matthew 17. It's after 6 days they go up on the mountain. And then in Exodus 40, the way the book ends, they have finished the pattern of the tabernacle. They have built the tabernacle. And then the cloud of God's presence descends on the tabernacle where his presence is meant to dwell. And all the people are left looking at it, filled with God's glory, knowing they shouldn't get too close because they're sinful. So Exodus is this pattern of God's presence coming down with his people. Moses in particular seems to be the mediator. He would go up and meet with God. He'd come down, his face would be shiny because he's seen God. But in Exodus chapter 32, there's an incident where Moses is up on the mountain and the people get frustrated and impatient. They decide to build an image of God. They build a golden calf and they say, this is the God that has saved you out of Egypt. Moses comes down and breaks the tablets and is extremely angry. And he turns in prayer to God and says, God, first of all, you can't give up on us. But also, if you're not going to go with us when you lead us out of this wilderness into the land you've promised for us, if you're not going to be with us, then don't lead us out at all. We're not going if you're not going to be there. And he says, I want to see your glory. I want to see what makes you God. I want to see what makes you I am. In Exodus 33 and 34, Moses has this crisis of faith because he's seen the people's brokenness. He understands God's holiness, and he doesn't know how this whole thing is going to work out. So, on the mountain, God asks Moses to come back up to him, and he does. And it says he makes his glory pass by him. And what we get is not a mental image of what the glory looks like, but it says, the glory of the Lord passed by Moses, and the Lord said, and he hears a voice. And the voice speaks, Exodus 34, 6 and 7. The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. Moses sees God's glory, and this is what God says. I'm merciful and I'm gracious. I'm slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. These words, merciful, gracious, slow to anger. In some translations, one of the words will talk about God's compassion. And this word, uniquely fit for Mother's Day, this word is tied to the word that will show up all throughout the Old Testament as womb. It's speaking in some sense, if you'll permit me, of God's motherly qualities. That's the way God shows compassion on his people. In the way that a mother carries a child in her womb is part of the way God shows love for his people. And what we learn in the book of Exodus is that is the very glory of God. This is what Moses learns. This is who God is. That's how this is going to work out. That's how the golden calf worshipers will still be God's people, because of his compassion and steadfast love and faithfulness to his people. So Moses comes down the mountain. His face is shining from meeting with God. Fast forward all the way to Matthew chapter 17. And here we see Jesus leading his friends up on a high mountain again. And they actually see Moses and they see Elijah. Jesus is transformed before their eyes, so he is shining. A cloud descends just like in the book of Exodus, and a voice calls out just like in the book of Exodus. This time in Matthew 17, the voice says, "This is my beloved Son with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." So on a mountain, they experience a cloud, they hear a voice, they see Elijah, and they see Moses. The glory, though, on this mountain is not coming from some outside source shining on to Jesus. No, Jesus is the source of the shining light in Matthew 17. It wasn't coming from Moses and it wasn't coming from Elijah. No, part of what is happening here is Jesus is in a whole other category from Moses and from Elijah. See, they would have looked up to Moses and Elijah for a couple of reasons. One, both of them have stories of being on a mountain, seeing the glory of God. Elijah was in 1 Kings 19. And he also hears a voice. A still small whisper is what your Bible might say. So they would have said Moses and Elijah both have seen the glory of God on a mountain. That's maybe why they're there. The other reason is Moses and Elijah would have been associated with Moses, the law, and Elijah, the prophets. The law and the prophets, or the shorthand for what we would call the Old Testament, or they would have called the Hebrew Scriptures. Jesus is in a class all by himself among them on that mountain, though. This whole event is displaying Jesus as the one who shines with the very glory of God. He is the same God that Moses saw on the mountain. He is the same God that Elijah experienced through the voice on the mountain. And then the voice calls out in verse 5 and echoes a very similar theme that we heard in Exodus chapter 34. In verse 5 it says, "This is my beloved Son." Beloved. And in Exodus 34, 6 and 7, he says, the Lord, merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love. Now we see in Matthew 17 the object of the Father's love. It is the Son. This is the Son of God whom the Father has never stopped loving. And what we are meant to take away from the story of transfiguration in Matthew 17 is that this is reality. This is definitely supernatural. We might walk away from something like this thinking, that was crazy. Jesus even describes it as a vision in verse 9. But something we've got to fight to wrap our minds around is just because something's supernatural doesn't mean it's out of the ordinary. This actually is the most ordinary thing that could have ever happened. This supernatural event is not out of the ordinary. No, it's quite the opposite. This is the most natural thing that ever was, because this is a picture, this is an experience of ultimate reality. Ultimate reality is Jesus shining in his glory, the Father declaring his love, and people standing in awe. How, you say, is this ultimate reality? It doesn't feel like ultimate reality. I've lived a reality all my life and never seen anything like this. So how could this be ultimate reality? Well, it's because this is the reality underneath everything we experience. C.S. Lewis says this, "If I find in myself desires which nothing in this world can satisfy." You know this quote? If I find in myself desires that nothing in this world can satisfy. You've been there. The only logical explanation is that I was made for another world. This glimpse of glory in Matthew 17 shows us that there's something beneath this world after all. There's a reality that lies underneath every good thing you've experienced. That's the current underneath it. There's a reality that's going to redeem all the bad things you've experienced. There's something greater, something beyond our suffering, beyond the evil in this world. There's something greater than our greatest memories. There's something that we were made for. So we have this deep desire to be loved and accepted. And as it turns out, there's a source of love that does exactly that. We seem to be designed to love something, really anything. And as it turns out, there is a God who's worthy of love and worship just like that. Our attention restlessly roams the earth, looking for something to fix our gaze on. And as it turns out, there is a God glorious enough to demand our eternal attention. See, we're captivated by all kinds of beauty. People, places, art, stories, music, food. Well, there really is a God who's the source of all that beauty and is himself more beautiful than all of them. We crave the presence of greatness, visiting the natural wonders of the world as well as lived experiences with great people, great musicians, speakers, authors, leaders. We love to be in the presence of greatness. And as it turns out, there really is a presence that can so captivate us forever. There is a reality underneath the reality you live every single day. That reality is the very glory of God. That's the source of all beauty, the source of the only love that can accept you forever, the one who is worthy of your love forever, the one who can demand your attention forever. That is ultimate reality. The problem, though, is that it's not easy to learn to live in this reality. It's not easy at all, and we see that in Matthew chapter 17 as we keep reading. So they get a vision of reality, then they move on and they begin to see the problem. It's not easy to live in light of this. The disciples are reminded multiple times in this passage that Jesus will not always be with them. In verses 9 to 13, we see this interesting bit about the Son of Man suffering and Elijah must come. And Jesus says, the new Elijah has come. The new prophet has come. It was John the Baptist. They didn't recognize him, but they did to him whatever they pleased. So also the Son of Man will suffer at their hands. Then later on in verses 22 and 23, Jesus foretells his death and resurrection, like we talked about last week. How he's going to die. And verse 23 tells us, and they were greatly distressed. When the disciples heard this, that Jesus is not going to be with them forever, they were distressed. Our lives may feel like this reality, this ultimate reality, isn't actually real at all. That's how the disciples felt in these moments. These three, Peter, James, and John, go up on the mountain and see this glory. And then they come right back down to Jesus saying, and I'm not going to be with you forever. I mean, talk about hot and cold swinging back and forth. And Peter thinks, I didn't want to leave up there because of how glorious and amazing it was. I wanted to reorder my life around that, and now you're telling me you're not going to be with me anymore? Can I just acknowledge our lives can feel like that? Like you can come here and hear God's word, experience incredible worship through song, experience prayer, pray with God. And Monday can be difficult. You can catch a glimpse of ultimate reality, and then you can go right back to your life and think, there's a problem. I seem to be not experiencing that ultimate reality in my life. Our lives might feel like this reality isn't actually real at all. And this is the distressing dilemma that we live in. We ask the question, what is ultimate reality? What seems like ultimate reality to us? See, part of our, I can't even get to it. As we've learned about kids from hard places, every kid, you did this when you were a little kid, whether you knew it or not. I can guarantee you didn't know it. You will adjust to the reality that you experienced in your first few years of life. You'll adjust, for better or for worse. Your first few years of existence will set the trajectory of how you live and relate to human beings for the rest of your life. That's not to say there's not redemption. That's not to say there's not healing. And much of that can be undone and relearned. But the reality is, if you put a kid in a certain kind of reality, they will figure out how to exist in it, even if it's an unhealthy one. They will adjust their lives to live in that reality that they're in. So, you put a kid in an orphanage that has way too many kids and not enough caretakers, they will eventually learn that their cries are not going to be heard. They won't cry anymore. You introduce a child to a situation where they're sexually abused over and over and over. I read a story this week in a book from a trauma therapist who did a lot of work about why these things happen. And he told a story of an experience of this little girl that thought that he wanted a sexual relationship with her and he was her therapist. And he said, what I learned was she had this pathway in her brain that anytime she saw an older male, she had just learned that's all that he wants. She was adjusting to the reality that she was experiencing. And just like these kids from hard places who maybe they're living in a home where they're food insecure. They don't know where their next meal is coming from. They're hoarding and hiding food, stealing it, overeating. They're trying to adjust to the reality that they've learned, which is, I don't know where I'm going to eat next. I've got to do as much as I can right now because I'm not sure where it's coming. And here's the catch. Just because you change their reality overnight doesn't mean the habits of how they've learned to live will change. They have learned to live in a reality like that. But here's the truth for all of us. You have learned that too. You may have learned that the primary or maybe only way you are loved is if you achieve the things that your caretakers wanted you to achieve. So you live with a burden on yourself to perform well in order to be worthy of love. Maybe you learn to be the peacemaker in a chaotic household. You've learned that your needs and your wants are irrelevant. So put them away. Because your role in this relationship is to be the peacemaker. So you take blame you don't deserve, you carry weights that aren't yours, and you put yourself in the middle of broken relationships because that is where you feel at home. Because it's the only home you ever knew. We have all learned to live in this reality that we've been given. We learn to cope with the broken reality that we find ourselves in. But here's the key. Just because you've learned to live within this world does not mean that's the way the world ought to be. Just because you've learned a way of living in this world doesn't mean that's the way the world should be. It just means you've learned to live in light of it. So you're experiencing a reality that's broken with imperfect people trying to care for you and love you and show you the way. You've been hurt. You have sinned and been sinned against. And we've all learned to cope, how to live in light of that reality. Just like the disciples are having this crisis of faith. They hear and see the glory of Jesus and then are told Jesus is leaving. And we think, okay, I see something that's ultimate reality, but then I'm forced to live in light of a reality that Jesus is not present. What do I do? Maybe that's you. You've learned to cope and to live in a reality that is broken. And the challenge for you this morning is to remember that just because you've learned to live within this world, just because you've learned a way of doing business, a way of doing life, a way of relating to people, that doesn't mean that's the way the world should be. Just because you feel terrified at night and cannot get rest and cannot believe that you are safe does not mean that you are really in danger. Just because you think every relationship is some attack on you and you've got to always be in defense mode doesn't mean that's really how everyone's relating to you. But the truth is we've all learned to relate. We've all learned to live in light of the broken world that we're in. But we must remember what ultimate reality really is. It's the shining glory of Jesus and the eternal love of God. So the disciples were faced with a dilemma. They'd seen the ultimate reality, and they were forced to live in one that looked radically different. So if you think the faith that was sold to me in church looks totally disconnected from the life I've been forced to live, welcome. You're starting to be honest about the Bible in your life. Don't push the church away. Lean in, because you're not alone. We face that same reality every day. So, side note, when I'm studying for this big chapter, and I've been committed to taking these multiple stories together, it's very discouraging when I open up commentaries and they say, opening chapter 17, there is no coherent way to take this chapter in one large story. I think, challenge accepted. You PhD, brilliant mind. We will find a way to make this work. And I think we have. Because in chapter 17, you see ultimate reality, then you see the problem. 2 places, Jesus says, I'm leaving. But then what you see is the invitation to a life of faith. Now here's what I mean by that. They come down the mountain to this crisis of faith. The disciples can't cast out a demon out of a boy. One demon, one boy, and the other 9 disciples are standing around, and Jesus and the 3 walk up, and it's like, they can't do it. Jesus laments to them that he's not going to be with them forever, and that he has to do this for them now. The disciples don't understand, and they're going like, why can't we do this? Jesus' answer is actually quite simple. There's a lack of faith. There's a lack of faith. Now, scholars wrestle over what does this mean? In what way did they not have the kind of faith that they should have? And the way I see it is there's kind of 2 main options here, and I wonder if you can find yourself in one of these. One is a prideful faith. Mark situates this story right after they had been sent out to go do ministry on Jesus' behalf, and then they come back, and then they can't do this. Mark 9. So a prideful faith would probably have the disciples in a posture like this. Man, we've done this so many times. This is easy. I know exactly what to do. You say this, you do this in this order, and then it doesn't work, and the next disciple goes, no, man, that's not how we did it when we went out. Let me show you. And they get up, and they try to do their method. And they think, hey, all of a sudden I've done this over and over. I've got the ability. I've got the strength. I know how to do these healings and these miracles now on my own. So after experiencing these miracles by their own hands, they had come to trust in their own abilities. That's prideful faith. So for some of us here today, one way that you may have a lack of faith in Jesus is your own spiritual pride. You begin to trust in yourself over Jesus. You've learned to trust in your own abilities to get by. You've become dependent on yourself. You've forgotten that apart from Jesus, you can do nothing, John 15, verse 5. But there's another side to this. There's poor faith. Maybe what happened is Jesus is up on the mountain, and they see this father pleading about his demon-possessed son, and they look around for Jesus. And they see Jesus isn't there, and they begin to go, we don't know what to do. I don't think I can do this. I don't think I know. I've not encountered a situation quite like this. I don't think I know how to get this demon out. I don't know what to do. Another way we might have a lack of faith is by being literally poor in our faith. They might have struggled to believe they could do anything. And this is some of you this morning. You think there's no way Jesus could do anything through you. You're too weak, too bad, too young, too old, too inexperienced, too religious, not religious enough, and you have poor faith. But here's what I think Jesus is inviting us into. He's inviting us to see that both of these situations, prideful faith and poor faith, actually center on us and not on Jesus. Here's what I mean. Prideful faith says that I'm too good and I don't need Jesus' power. Poor faith says I'm too bad and Jesus isn't powerful enough to help me. Do you see how both scenarios actually elevate you and decenter Jesus? The solution is not more faith, but pure faith. See, we don't need a prideful faith that begins to depend on ourselves. God is not growing you up into independence. That's the difference between the way we raise kids and God raises his own. God is not raising you to be more and more independent of him. You don't need prideful faith. You also don't need poor faith. Jesus delights to use you, and you have the power of Jesus. We don't need prideful faith or poor faith. We need pure faith. Their faith didn't lack quantity, but quality. Their faith was weak or poor or little. And it wasn't about the size of their faith, but it was about the object of it. Both prideful and poor faith, both have their object in me. Either I am good enough or I am not. Both of them have removed Jesus from the equation. What Jesus is teaching them is, you've seen ultimate reality. You've experienced the tension that I'm not going to be with you forever. So the invitation for you is, you better learn to live by faith and not by sight. Because if you live by sight, you're going to be adjusting your life to the reality you experience instead of the reality you know is true but is unseen. He's saying you must learn to live by faith and not by sight. And here's the last story. The temple tax. They show up to the temple in Capernaum, and they go up to Peter and say, does your teacher not pay the tax? He says, yes. I love this. Peter gives an answer. It's like, yes, Jesus, we paying this? I love that so much because it's so relatable. And Jesus goes, what do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth take toll or tax? From their sons or from others? And when he said from others, Jesus said to him, then the sons are free. So pause right there for a second. This is temple. This isn't a Roman tax. This is Jewish. So there would not have been a king over the temple at this time. There's no ruler. There's no governor over the temple. So what is Jesus talking about? Hey, who are the ones who are free from giving a tax to the temple? The one who's a son of the owner of the temple. Well, what's the temple all about? The very presence of God. So who is free from giving a tax to the temple? The one who's the very son of God. In other words, refer yourself back to Matthew 17, verses 1 to 8. I would say the eternally beloved Son of God does not need to give a tax to the temple that was made for his presence. So in Matthew 17, we have the living temple walking into the temple, being told you need to give a tax. And Jesus said to him, the sons are free, verse 27. However, not to give offense to them, go to the sea, cast a hook, take the first fish that comes up, and when you open its mouth, you'll find a shekel. Take that and give it to him for me and for yourself. Jesus is teaching them to live by faith and not by sight. And sometimes when we live by faith, we have to be wise about when we choose to fight. Jesus could have easily said, do you know who I am? If only you were on the mountain with me, you'd know who you were asking to pay the temple tax. You fool. Why would you ask me? Have you not seen my story so far? You're asking me to pay the temple tax? I mean, Jesus could have gone into that fight. The disciples could have, and later on we see that they will fight on Jesus' behalf. Wrongly, I might add. So Jesus asked to pay the temple tax. It's laughable, but Jesus still pays the tax so that he doesn't offend. Jesus knows what ultimate reality is. But he also knows he does not have to live an offensive life in order to live according to ultimate reality. Some Christians today don't understand that. We think by the very nature of believing the gospel, we have to try everything we can to offend people. But Jesus wanted to love people where they were, and in this case, that meant they were in the temple, worshiping according to the customs and regulations of Judaism. He wanted to meet them where they were, love them, and introduce them to ultimate reality. See, it takes wisdom for us to know when to confront and when things are not worth fighting over. That's part of living by faith and not by sight. When we live according to the ultimate reality of Jesus and his kingdom, we will find ourselves in contrast to the kingdom of this world. That's the reality we experience, the kingdom of this world, the ways of this world, the values of this world, the temptations to live for certain things in this world. And Jesus is saying, in that contrast, please, followers, when I am leaving you, do not always choose a fight. But rather, 1 Timothy chapter 2, this is a famous passage where Paul's saying, I desire in all places for holy hands to be raised. Pray. And it's the verse, if you've been raised in church, you've probably prayed this around like July 4th or National Day of Prayer. Let's pray for the elected officials, right? And they rip this verse out of context. Do you know what the next verse says? That we may live. So it's literally the same sentence. Pray for the officials. Pray for those in leadership over your land, that we may live quiet and godly lives. Quiet. Hey, I want to pray for those in charge that they just leave us alone. And I'll leave them alone. That we can live according to ultimate reality and have a winsome and loving introduction to this ultimate reality. Not in a way that's going to go to the temple and say, let's fight. Let me prove to you I'm not paying your little tax. But when we're living according to the ultimate reality of Jesus and his kingdom, confrontation and contrast will come about. Jesus is modeling for his disciples how to live by faith and not by sight. And that means at times, just quietly go along. Be a faithful presence within. But know all along that your faith is in a reality that's greater than where you are. We must continue living by faith in him, but we must also exercise this kind of wisdom. Because Jesus was concerned with being present and earning a hearing among those people. So he didn't just want to offend them so early on that none of them would listen. So this passage in some ways is Jesus preparing his followers for when he's gone. Hey, you need to know what ultimate reality is all about. It's my glory and the Father's love. And I know that's going to be hard because I'm going to be leaving. And you're going to be tempted to order your life around a reality you experience. Please live by faith. Don't forget this moment. I really am this glorious, even if it looks like I'm not. Even if you see me hanging on a cross and I look like the opposite of an enthroned king, don't forget this. Me shining in my glory. When I ascend to the Father and I'm no longer walking this earth, and everyone tells you that what you're believing is a lie, and people don't come back from the dead, and the body was stolen, and it's a big conspiracy, don't forget this. That I have not left you forever. I am shining with my Father at his right hand in perfect glory, and I will come to finish what I've started. Don't forget this. This is ultimate reality. The test for us is, will we live by faith in what is unseen? Or will we fold and live only according to what we see in this life? Will you live according to ultimate reality by faith? Or will you live according to the reality that you experience every day and order your life around that? Let's pray together.